Today it is my great pleasure to have Nick Dirks with us. And I think that the best way to introduce Nick is to ask him to tell us about himself, because otherwise, and I'm sure you had so many accomplishments that I'll miss some of them. So please introduce yourself.
Okay, Shai, I'll do that. But first of all, it's great to be talking with you. I just want to remark that my association with the University of the People, which began when I met you at a reception, I think in the summer of 2013, just after I'd begun my time as Chancellor of the University of California at Berkeley, commenced both a wonderful friendship and the establishment of our collegial relationship, but also introduced me to the extraordinary work being done by the University of the People. Although I had known about it before, since before I became Chancellor. You see, I'll introduce myself, but by telling a story.
It's a nice way to introduce yourself, though.
With the University of the People at the center of it. Since before I was Chancellor of Berkeley, I was the Executive Vice President of the Arts and Sciences and Dean of the Faculty at Columbia University in New York. I succeeded a man by the name of David Cohen, who early on was the inaugural provost of the University of the People, and of course was associated, I think still is associated with the university. So I knew about it from David, and David was the one who had in fact initially recruited me to go to Columbia, not to succeed him. That wasn't on the cards at that time, but rather to chair the Department of Anthropology at Columbia, which I began to do in 1997. So I met David. David obviously met you at some point, and was both recruited to the university, and then through his recruitment of me, made it possible for me to meet you and get involved in the university. I've been an academic all my life. I've been blessed by being at and associated with very fine universities. And I grew up in the shadow of a university because my father was a professor at Yale. But my father's story is actually one that is relevant here because he himself was the first, and indeed in his generation, the only person to go to college. He grew up in a small farm in central Iowa. Grew up speaking Plattdeutsch, which is a dialect of German that is spoken at the very far north, of Germany, right on the border with Holland. He and his forefathers left Prussia because of the draft and because of political circumstances. So they were political refugees, and settled and became farmers. And there just wasn't any question of going to college. But my father had a bad heart, and he was unable to do the physical labor of being a farmer. So the family wasn't sure what to do. He finally got a few good grades in his high school, and they said, "Okay, you can go to college if you can work your way through. You have to take care of all the expenses yourself." No, that was a day when college was a lot cheaper than it is today. But he went off. Initially, he was going to become a minister and go back to his family, but he went on, got a PhD, and became a professor. So his story was one that, of course, I grew up with, but which inspired me and really opened up for me what the world of the university was, but also how university education, how education itself can open up the world.
Wow. Okay. Please continue. Okay, so where did you start? And, please walk us through your history.
So I was, as I say, blessed by growing up near a university, knowing about a university. My father spent a year when I was 12 years old teaching at a small college in southern India, outside a city then called Madras, now called Chennai. And I was 12, but I had a magnificent year. And it was really on the basis of that year in India that I just became fascinated with India, with South India, with the language Tamil, which I subsequently studied and worked in. but also with Asia and with trying to understand the world beyond the small little suburban American background in which I grew up. And so when I went to college and had an opportunity to do a little bit of research, I went back to that same place and I did some research, and then I went to graduate school to continue the work of trying to understand more about India's history, India's culture, India's civilization. And it was because of that fascination with another place, a very far way away from where I grew up, and in a time when there were no easy ways to communicate. Telephone calls were very expensive, and there were very few phones in India. Couldn't use our phones to make instant connections around the world, but which for me was a benefit because it meant I had to actually travel to this place and I had to spend time there and I had to immerse myself both in the language and the culture. And so I wrote about Indian history. I wrote a book about the caste system in India and managed to get jobs to teach, first at Caltech, then at the University of Michigan, then at Columbia, which brings the story back to where I left it off at the beginning, and then finally to Berkeley, where I had the great honor to be the 10th chancellor. But I never forgot in all the work I did as an administrator, how fundamentally the university is about changing lives. And again, I began with the experience of my father, which made possible my own experience. But I too found that going to a college where I could study what I was passionate about literally opened up the world for me and gave me opportunities the like of which I just never imagined possible when I was going to school before college, and indeed when I was thinking about what I might be when I grow up.
And just to mention, Berkeley, while you were the chancellor, we signed an agreement where our students were able to, after 2 years with us, when they get their associate, to continue their education toward BA in Berkeley. And the first students who did it was not only graduated with straight A, she was just accepted to MIT to continue her to graduate school. So a great success, and it has been a great achievement for her, obviously, but for UoPeople as well, because it just shows our quality and the fact that universities such as Berkeley had accepted our student means a lot about recognition of the quality and giving opportunity to our students. So
I was so pleased, Shai, to sign that agreement. And I felt the agreement was, in fact, a reflection both of the importance of the university, of the people, as well as the commitment that Berkeley itself had to access. And I say that quite literally because although I've been, as I say, blessed by being associated with great universities, what was particularly striking about the University of California, and Berkeley in particular, was that it had a commitment from its origins to making sure that students who never really imagined the possibility that they might be able to go to a university like Berkeley could have the opportunity to do so. When the first chancellor of the University of California, of the University of California at Berkeley, Clark Kerr, when he was chancellor and then president of the system, he established a plan called the Master Plan, in which 1/3 of Berkeley students had to come from two-year colleges, from community colleges, either in California or elsewhere. They had to transfer in. And it was really intended to open up a pathway to one of the finest universities in the world for students, again, who often struggled against the odds, even to go to a community college. And I thought that in many ways, those students were proxies for the kinds of students who take advantage of the educational opportunities of the University of the People, oftentimes either because of the strife in which they find themselves or a background in which their families are not either highly educated or with the means to think about sending their children to one of the finest colleges. You see young people who simply don't think they would have that opportunity, leave alone the opportunity to go to a place like Berkeley. So Berkeley has in its charter this commitment. And so going there for me, particularly going there from the Ivy League, which is, a little more elitist, I became totally, really committed to this idea that you have to have multiple pathways for education. And you have to give opportunities, especially for young people who don't think they're ever going to get that kind of chance. And every time you see something like that happen, in the case of our working together of a student who got into Berkeley who never thought they'd be able to go there and then goes on to MIT, you see in a single instance the kind of promise that educational efforts like the University of the People offer to so many of our citizens who simply don't have those opportunities coming naturally to them.
Obviously, as you know, I can't agree more with you, and I think that it was. That's what we're doing, and not a lot of universities do it like Berkeley under your leadership, and it's too bad because we take students. Some of them, we are the only opportunity for them. But if that doesn't mean that they're not qualified, and it doesn't mean that they can't reach heights, and we should help them get there. And agreement with the university, like the one that was actually the first students who did it, and now we have other universities such as NYU and McGill and Edinburgh, and opening the gates to those universities is amazing, and we can't be happier than doing it. So switching to your experience, you're academic for many years and with a lot of experience, amazing achievements. What is the one lesson that you would pass on to our students? Well, you can take two if you want.
I'm going to say, as a professor, we never can really boil it all down to one lesson. We usually teach in 10 lessons and, longer periods of time. But, I think one of the things that I learned from my study of history is that, people assume when you're living at a particular moment, things are always going to be the same. And this is true both for societies and for individuals, that the hand you're dealt or the situation you find yourself in is simply going to stay the same, no matter what you do. And one of the things that history teaches us is that there can be dramatic changes that take place. And when you're living in the moment, you don't see it coming. As a historian, you get the luxury of looking back, and you can see both where people were at a particular moment when they're in a situation where they might be thinking, well, this is it, it's not going to change. But you look back from a perspective where you see the change that happened. And of course, as a historian, you try to understand why things change, how things change. And you find, of course, that sometimes things change for reasons that you wouldn't have found obvious at the time. But they always change because of actions of individual people, and not just people at the top, not just kings and queens and presidents and prime ministers, but usually change is driven by individuals who are outside the structures of power, but who want to take hold of a particular issue or a particular moment and call for the things that they hold dear, and strive usually by working with other individuals, by forming collectivities to try to make a better world. And it happens. And, again, it's sometimes very dispiriting in the moment to think, oh, things are like this. I'm not going to ever get out of the situation. That situation isn't going to change. But history shows us a continuous record of change. Again, not always for the better, but oftentimes for the better. So that's, as a historian, one of the things I would say. Now, I'm also, Shai, an anthropologist, and also I give my second lesson around around the other discipline that I work in, which is to say, when I was growing up in a small suburb in Connecticut, I had no real idea of the world outside. And going to India as a 12-year-old, studying India over the course of my academic career, I've come to see that not only are there all kinds of differences that I've had to really struggle to understand between the ways in which life is lived and organized and some of the ways in which culture and society and politics operate. There's also a fundamental connectivity. And what I was able to see, even at moments of the greatest sort of consternation about different ways of living, that the most fundamental lesson of that experience was the kinds of connections I could make, whether I was in a small village in South India, or whether I was in a city somewhere, whether I was at a temple or a mosque. And however it was that I was positioned to meet people who came from very different places, but who, when you met them, established immediately the human connection that unites us around the world. So those are two lessons I take from my work in history and anthropology.
So going to the second one, we are very proud, and I keep telling our students and others that one of the things that I'm most proud is of ours, putting students, every time they take a class, 20 students from 20 countries. Every time they take another class, another 20 new students from 20 countries. So the interaction, being open to the world, learn other cultures and other people is a great asset that we give them. But I want to go back to your perspective as an historian. How do you see, as an historian, the effect of COVID on higher education?
Yeah, such an interesting question. And the first thing I'll say is kind of obvious, and it doesn't, it's not specific to history or any particular discipline. But as a professor and as a citizen of a university, what we've learned in COVID, of course, is that just because we can't meet in person doesn't mean we can't stop connecting. And it certainly doesn't mean we have to stop learning. I've been involved, again, for years and years and years in education. And I think it's fair to say that even though technology was developing very quickly, and we had things like Skype, and we had, different, even using television, we had forms of televised instruction that would take place either through some kind of university like the Open University in the UK, or through different efforts in the US or elsewhere around the world. You had a great deal of resistance to technology on the part of most university professors and on the part of most university administrators. Well, that resistance disappeared in March of 2020 because we had no other option. We were simply told we were not supposed to meet with each other. That would be far too dangerous for our health and the health of our students. And lo and behold, people who swore they would never teach online began to teach online. And Shai, one of the interesting things about this is that this year, as places like Berkeley and Columbia have gone back to teaching in person, is that a lot of faculty and a lot of students actually found that they miss a lot of what they experienced when they were learning online. Because, for example, you have a lot more flexibility. You can be in any number of places. You don't have to, find yourself on a college campus to be there at 10 o'clock in the morning when the lecture takes place. You can even have combination of synchronous and asynchronous learning experiences. Most lectures now at places like Berkeley are actually recorded. And many students, even with in-person classes, have decided not to go for the lecture because they can watch it online. They only go for the discussion group, and that's because there isn't an option. And if there is an option, they would often choose to do that. So this has been a remarkable transformation. And before the pandemic, of course, the University of the People was using online technology. And not everybody thought it was a great idea. Now, not only has everybody experienced it, but people have realized that it is the future, and it has to be the future. It won't necessarily displace in-person education when students have that opportunity, but it's always going to be there. And so we can say over the last 2 years that higher education has undergone a fundamental transformation. But, there are other things too, Shai, and I'll just mention one as a historian. I mentioned my father, but my mother had an older brother who almost died when he was 2 years old. Her older brother was born in 1916, and when he was 2, it was 1918. And there was what we called the Spanish flu in 1918. The truth of the matter is that I didn't know very much about that pandemic until this pandemic, except that story that my mother sometimes told me of how the whole family talked about the fact that Uncle John, who is my Uncle John, was so ill because of this virus that nobody understood. But, millions and millions of people died because of that. And that was before we had vaccines. It's before public health really understood the nature of viral infections. But the funny thing is, if you go back and you read a history of the 1918 pandemic, you see many of the same kinds of things that are happening today. People were wearing masks. People were social distancing. People were not going to crowded movie theaters or plays or whatever. Really? But the cities and countries that followed the public health dictates, they weren't mandates, they were just suggestions, actually did better in the pandemic. So okay. Anyway, the point is that you find that sometimes history, if you ignore it, comes back and repeats itself. But there are things you can still learn from it and from an experience that takes place for previous generations that helps one understand not only that there were pandemics before, but that people got out of the pandemic. And that, I think, is probably the most critical lesson, because over the course of the last 2 years, many of our students, both at the University of the People, places like Berkeley and so on, have thought, this is it. We'll never get past this. We will.
That's a nice lesson. So why don't I ask you my final question, which is, what advice would you give to UoPeople's students from your experience? And, you have shown us how much you know. So please share with us.
Well, it's always tempting to give, too much advice because ultimately, we know that our students in the University of the People have already done something without necessarily following our advice that is really critical for them. And that is that they've enrolled in a degree program at the university. And they've enrolled to learn something they didn't know before, to better themselves, to prepare for a career, to make for themselves a life that they will, in which they will be able to make an impact in the world and have a better life for themselves and their families. So you could say that the target audience for our conversation today doesn't really need more advice, except, again, as a professor, one always gives advice when asked. I think what I would say, Shai, is that there's nothing easy about education. And it doesn't ever get easy. Because even though we know why we want to learn something, we know why we want to take a course, we know why we want to get a degree, we forget how much we have to work to actually, come to terms with the complexity, the detail, sometimes just the difficulty of the things that we're studying. I have a son who is terrified of math, and he had to force himself to do mathematics in high school and college, and now he's taking graduate level statistics in a master's program. But he never thought he could do it, and we encouraged him, but he stuck with it. So the advice is really that if you're having trouble in a class, if you're thinking, I just don't know if I'm going to stick with this, if the pressures of life that exert themselves on you make it sometimes seem like you just don't have the bandwidth to keep going with your degree, try to think about the longer term and recognize that everyone has these kinds of challenges. Everybody has these thoughts of, I'll just stop this and I'll go on with everyday life. Maybe I'll come back later. Don't do that. Stick with it. Because at the end of the day, not only will you persevere, not only will you succeed, but you'll also find yourself able to do things you never thought possible. And that is what then gives you the confidence. It's not just the degree. It's the confidence you get from doing this work that makes it possible for you to go on and do extraordinary things in the world. So I think our students are fabulous, but I know if they ever get discouraged, they will have to worry about these things, have to think about these things. My advice, stay with it.
That's a fascinating advice, and I like most the part about teach yourself that you can do it and reach new heights. Nick, that was amazing video or discussion, and we will show it to our students and the world. And I would like to thank you again for giving us the time and the advice and the wisdom. And thanks, and I hope that you're right about the world and about all your predictions. Thank you, Nick.
Shai, thank you so much, and all the very best to all of the students who are listening today.